Hey everyone, really excited to chat with you all today. And let me get my screen up here. All right. So we're going to talk about some creative ways to measure community. Again, my name is Erik Martin. I'm the VP of Services here at Commsor. I've been working in the community industry for about 15 years. And for about 15 of those 15 years, measurement and ROI and figuring out how to calculate the output and the outcomes of all the hard, amazing work we do in community management has been a constant challenge and a constant puzzle. And I'm sure many of you all can relate. And I just want to be clear, if you are hoping to walk away from my session or other sessions today with some sort of magic formula or some sort of assessment that's going to solve all your ROI challenges, all your reporting challenges, then it's, hate to break it to you, but that's not going to happen because it doesn't exist. Measuring the return on what we do and measuring the output and the performance of different tactics we try is a constantly evolving and challenging puzzle. It's one that I find personally really, really exciting and rewarding, but it's kind of tied up in the work itself. Today, if you are here to learn some ways other communities, and I have some pretty wide range of examples here, but some other communities have been creative in trying to measure their output and measure and report on their ROI. And also, if you're interested in learning some new frameworks that you may not have seen before that can help you and your team and your stakeholders and peers come up with creative tactics that work for what you're trying to measure. And if you're here to learn from each other, then you're definitely in the right place. So excited to share. Excellent. So let's see. One thing, just again, before we get into some examples here, just want to acknowledge that measuring community is hard, and take a minute to talk a little bit about why it's hard. Even though it's frustrating, I think the fact that measuring community is challenging is a good sign. If it were easy to measure, then in some ways it would kind of be easy to do. If it were easy to measure, then that would also mean that the impact isn't as far reaching. It doesn't have as many ripples in what it is that we do. If community only impacted one part of the business, it'd certainly be easier to measure, but we know that's not the case. We know community can impact all different parts of an organization. If community fit nicely in one box or one silo or one traditional sort of C-level reporting structure, it might make things a little easier, but we know that's not the case. We know community kind of cuts across traditional silos, traditional departments, traditional stakeholders, and that's why it's so powerful. It also means it's challenging to measure. So I think it's important to acknowledge, like, community is hard to measure because it's made up of human beings. Human beings, we are extremely complex. We have a lot of different variables. The ways we interact with the community, the way our different communities that we're a part of are all overlapping and intertwined and evolving and not static, is extremely complex. And so that's one of the reasons why it's extremely challenging to measure community. But again, I think that challenge points to just how powerful and how evolving this industry we find ourselves in is. Also, just want to acknowledge too that we're not in a vacuum, and other departments, other people we might work with, other industries also have this constant challenge of measuring and reporting on ROI. And even in even in some of the most well-established, well-resourced tools and tactics out there, this is a challenge they also are constantly working on. So these two figures are from a recent research paper that was published by Google. The title of the paper was Challenges and Opportunities in Media Mix Modeling. These two figures here just are representing two of, I think they had like 12 different limitations to the way they currently model return on ad spend. So the point here is media mix modeling is something that's been around for, I don't know, decades. And it's something that the large platforms, Meta, Google, et cetera, are increasingly pushing as the best way to measure return on ad spend. Yet, even when you're dealing with, an industry with a lot of data, a lot of resources, a lot of sort of stakeholder support, like performance advertising, even when you're dealing with companies like Google and Meta that know more about us and what we do than probably, definitely than any organization ever has, and maybe more than any organization ever should, it's still extremely challenging for them to measure something as basic as how much of a return are we getting on our investment in spending ads on their platform. So, I do think there is a little bit of, because our community industry is not as well established, not as well resourced, not as well understood, there is a little bit of a sort of double standard or a different a different goal that we are held to, compared with other tactics, other activities that an organization might do. But just want to point out, even the best resourced ones, with all kinds of people working on it, still struggle with some of these basic reporting challenges. And that's not to say that we shouldn't try to measure the value of communities, or that it's a lost cause and we shouldn't even attempt to do these things. It's just, I think it's important to acknowledge it's a constantly evolving, constantly improving and endlessly complex process. And we should just know that going in. And I think knowing that it's extremely hard and extremely complex also means that it's even more important for us as community builders, as leaders in a company, as facilitators within the company we're working in to decide and to help the organization decide what is important to measure. And because then we can be creative in figuring out how the best way to measure those. So I want to start with one example that's actually from the community in the nonprofit space. And that is the Oregon Food Bank. So Oregon Food Bank, I live in North Carolina now, but I used to live in Portland, Oregon. Oregon Food Bank is, almost 40 years old. It's a statewide organization. They have over 1,000 food distribution sites. They have an annual operating budget of $100 million. And, so big organization, pretty calcified, a lot of inertia. They've been doing things the way they've been doing it for a while, partly because it works, but partly just because it's a pretty big machine they're running and a lot of people involved. But in 2020, they decided, they had a big review with staff and stakeholders and donors and partners, and they decided that they weren't measuring the most important thing for their organization. They weren't even trying to measure it. And that was love. They decided that in the next year, they would figure out how to measure love throughout the organization and in all the activities they do. So goal makes sense, seems obviously really important, but how do you actually do it? How do you measure love? So this is a challenge that they documented their process pretty well, and I found it super interesting as a community builder. So they wanted to look at how they would measure the impact. They wanted to be really clear that just because they were choosing to measure love, not didn't mean that they thought that was at odds with strong sort of traditional financial outcomes. Actually, they had the hypothesis that if they were able to measure and optimize for love, that would actually improve some of the traditional financial outcomes. And it's a little early, but so far that's proven to be at least directionally accurate. But they knew they needed to come up with a thoughtful, intentional, thorough, data-driven way, some alternative metrics that could let them measure love and operate in a way that traditionally, organizations in their field don't. So they worked with a bunch of different partners, including a longtime organizer in the social sector, Sherry Tang, And they really kind of started from the very beginning. They set out, they talked with all the stakeholders or all the people on the team. They looked at, how do we define love? What goes into love? What are these, here's an example of one of the artifacts that their work produced. These are 12 dimensions of love. What are the different, what does it mean when we talk about love in an organization? What are the different ways that shows up for individuals, for staff, for donors, for organizations they're working with? What are the attitudinal and behavioral indicators? What activities, what are our theories as an organization as to ways we could, increase the amount of love in the things that we're doing, and how might we measure those activities that are increasing the amount of love from the organization in ways that we could hold each other and ourselves accountable in terms of performance. So it's a year-long process, and we'll share a link in the follow-up if you're interested. It's really fascinating the way they did it. But they redid their all of their different surveys and assessments that they send out to donors, to staff, to partners, both annual ones and more frequent, monthly, weekly ones. And they came up with some really interesting changes to try to measure love. So here's just one example. This is something, and they're still, recently testing this out, and I'm sure refining it. But just to give you an idea, and instead of some of the traditional surveys that staff or partners might get, they started talking about different dimensions of love. They started measuring them, but in a little bit of a different way than you might see on a more traditional donor feedback form. They started really trying to define the different ways that love might show up in the people they work with. And then they also asked, and I think this is really important as community builders, they also asked the survey participants to share some open-ended stories, to share context. If they felt, maybe a particular, in this case, dimension of love was not high, was not as high as maybe the person wanted it to be, then they asked for context on why. And then they left a very sort of open-ended qualitative space for that context to be shared. The same thing when they went on to working with donors. Again, this is a small part of just one of the different survey tools they used, but I think you can see, how that sort of centralizing of love shows up in their feedback assessments that they're running their organization based on. They also shared stories. They shared stories from some of their clients, some of their partners in these surveys, and they asked people to respond to the stories to make sure that the connections in the stories were what they intended them to be, and just to understand how people were thinking about these complex human stories around hunger and food scarcity and some of the interventions they have. And again, this is something they're still, I'm sure, refining. I'm sure has a long way to go, but I think it's interesting to think about the challenge of a 40-year-old organization. Instead of centering everything around traditional financial measures, to centering everything around something as abstract and powerful as love, as an example of how you can really change the focus of an organization and around something that's admittedly difficult to measure. So I think it's pretty inspiring that they were able to embark on this at all. And so I like that story because I hear, and I've said these things myself, I hear a lot of community builders talk about, well, my stakeholder, my boss, the CEO, whoever, my client really wants to, they want a very clear, simple ROI. And, how do you measure the ROI of a sense of belonging? How do you measure the ROI of a relationship, of a connection, of knowledge being shared, of feedback, of all of these things that we know happen, these complex human things that happen inside the communities we manage. And I think I understand, I've said those same things myself, but I think it's really up to us to figure out what is important to measure, to work with all of those stakeholders so that we kind of work with them to determine what is important to measure. unpack what that means, as the Oregon Food Bank did in this example around love, and then really come up with creative, thoughtful ways to test and measure it. And those measurements don't have to be what the platforms that we use have in their defaults. It doesn't have to be around traditional measures of clicks and engagements. There's other ways to measure the output of community. And I think it also means that if we're looking to measure something, and even if we're looking to talk about it in very concrete, dollar and financial benefit terms, that doesn't mean we abandon the individual type stories. And in fact, in the framework that I'm about to show, the story part is really important in showing how sort of individual activities can ladder up to a concrete business result. So one of my favorite articles on measuring communities is actually one from about 2002. So 20 years old, held up pretty well. It's from a magazine that is not around anymore, called Knowledge Management. And it was called Measuring the Impact of Communities. And again, I'll share a link to this if you're interested in reading the whole thing. And this was focused on communities of practice. So if you're not familiar with the term, community of practice means it's a community for people who are essentially peers who are working on a similar challenge. Often they have very similar job titles, or they're working in a very similar sort of subset or niche of their industry. This was in 2002, so primarily this work was done on communities of practice that were internal to a specific company or organization, and for the most part offline. But I think it actually works pretty well for the modern, super extremely online communities that we have today. So I'll share one example from this article, and it's pretty short. It's about 6 pages, and then look at the framework they used. This example is also about as far away as you can get from the Oregon Food Bank, because it's about Shell Oil, horrible fossil fuel, profit maximizing, extraction maximizing company. And so but I think it's interesting how they justified the investment in their own community of practice in very concrete terms. So Shell Oil at the time had a community, and they may still do, I don't know, but they have a community practice just for their geologists. So all the people that figure out, what nice coastline they want to destroy, what place they want to drill for oil. And these are very resource intensive investments when they decide to set up an oil rig somewhere, or continue drilling or stop drilling somewhere. So there is a lot of investment needed when they choose to continue or start or stop at one of these drilling sites. So they had this community practice, and the management wanted to know, okay, this is, we have several people working on this. What's our ROI? Common question, I'm sure we've all been asked. So they approached it fairly simply. They looked at, they started with interviews, right? They interviewed the participants in the community of practice. They found out through these interviews, through talking with members, in this case, it was all people inside the same company, so it made some things a little easier. But they figured out that there's about, in 1 year, there's about three drilling and testing sites, or sorry, 3 sites where they did not test and they did not drill that year, based on some knowledge shared between the geologists in this community practice. All right, again, these are all rough approximations, but I think the way they arrived at a number is interesting. So they then figured out, well, for each one of those wells that we don't drill, it saves us about $20 million in terms of drilling and $20 million in terms of all the associated testing. So that's roughly $120 million of savings per year. And this is back in 2002 when $120 million was, real money. So then and here's where it's interesting. They talked with a few executives, right? So they talked with a few people who helped them come up with this number. And again, it's a very round number, 120 million. And they said, what's your confidence level? How confident are you that $120 million is the right approximation? And they came up with a number of 80%, right? So The executives that they talked to, the experts in this area said, well, we're about 80% sure this is the right ballpark of number. Great. So they multiply $120 million by 80%. Then they also realized, like, hey, these geologists may have figured out not to drill in these sites on their own. If this community practice didn't exist, they may have still figured that out. They're smart experts in their field, and there's other things they may have tipped them off or learned that this wasn't a good investment of the company's money. So they figured that there was probably a 25% chance that the information learned in the community practice was what really tipped the scale into these geologists recommending that they not drill. So again, they multiplied that by 25%, and they came up with a very conservative approximation that they had $24 million in annual savings. The community practice cost them $300,000 to $400,000 of annual investment in terms of overhead and in terms of some of the software and travel involved at the time. So they came up with again an approximate 40x return on investment. And this was just one sort of activity, one potential outcome from the community practice. And so this one showing like, hey, here's one example. We've been very conservative with how we've calculated it. It's approximate, but the executives saw this and were like, hey, that's good enough. That is good enough to show that this community practice is a worthwhile investment. We don't need to see anymore. And I think that's a lot of times when the funders, the executives, the clients are looking for return on investment. That's kind of what they're the level they're looking for. It doesn't have to be a super hard, fast, precise, and accurate number. It's just like, we want to know, is this, what are the signs? What's the, sort of back of the envelope calculation that would show that this is that we should continue investing this money in the community. And you don't have to exhaust all the different ways that it can help. Maybe you just need to find one or two examples that are clearer than the others. So this is the framework. This is the framework that the author of this article 20 years ago used to help come up with the value of a community practice. And this is not a formula. This is not something you would necessarily present to your stakeholders, to the C-suite, but it is a framework that I think can help you come up with figuring out what to measure and figuring out potentially how to measure it. And we'll share a worksheet version of this that you can actually use. We'll share that. And I think I know in my own work, it's been really helpful. And again, this is a 20-year-old framework. It's not perfect, but it stood the test of time, and I think it's super valuable. So you start with this idea of activities. So these are all the things that happen. This is the day-to-day work you do: introductions, onboarding messages, speakers, events, all these sort of individual activities. And then you kind of move up the framework, move up the pyramid to output. So these are actually like, what does someone gain? Do they gain knowledge? Do they gain access to something? Do they gain, if we're compensating the people, the members, do they gain financial compensation? Do they gain status in their field? All the stuff that they get. And then you look at and usually the output in this framework is in one of those categories: access to information, knowledge, or some sort of network, referral, social output. And then you kind of move up into what's the value? What's the value for the customer? What's the value for the organization as a whole? What's the value for the success team, for the sales team, for your group? Look at all the different ways values are being created. And then you can look at the top of what are the business results? Is it, decreased acquisition costs because the company has more brand affinity because of the community? Is it increased retention? Is it easier to attract talent? Is it easier, you can interview the people ops team, ask them, if they've hired from the community, what's their approximation of how much that helps them? So all the different ways that something in the community might lead to a business result. So you have all of these different ways that the community activities are creating different outputs, different types of value, and ultimately business results. And they don't all have to connect to each other, right? The goal is to find one or two threads that you usually identify from a story. And then you can find support for those, evidence, support, numbers for those threads that lead from activity. So here's something we did in the community of practice for geologists that led to savings, right? So this framework can help you figure out kind of where to look. And so I've updated the sort of order of operations here from this 20-year-old article. So again, you want to define and unpack the stakeholder needs. And actually, there's a session later on today talking about why community is important and how to go about asking your stakeholders, the leaders of your company, what are you hoping to get out of community? What do you think the value is to our members? So really kind of doing the work to get that from all the different people involved in the company. So you want to define and unpack it in the same way that the Oregon Food Bank sort of broke out 12 different types of, or 12 different ways that love could be shown by a nonprofit organization. You want to look at again, the activities, the outcomes, the type of value, not just for the company, but for specific teams, for individuals, for members, and for the organization as a whole. And then this is where, step 3 is decide, okay, what's our strategy? What do we want to measure? What's really important? It might be revenue, it might be decreased costs, it might be love, it might be something else. But really figure out what is it that you want to measure and what's your strategy of measuring it. And then, interviewing, surveying, talking to members, talking to internal participants, doing that on a ongoing basis to really understand those qualitative stories. And those stories are what's going to help you not only understand, but show the connection between activities all the way up to those sort of business metrics of value. And then just more of a general thought than a step. When you're estimating these signals, as the example in Shell Oil, it's okay to estimate. It's okay to estimate when you're looking backwards. It's okay to estimate when you're looking forward. But when you do so, as long as it's sort of in line with your strategy, and as long as you're relatively conservative, right? So again, the example there is they didn't just take that $120 million number. They asked the executives or the people who would be in the best position to estimate in the company, what's your confidence in this number? They said 80%. Great. That's still a really large number if you're taking 80% of 120 million. Then they also figured, okay, this may not be the only thing that led to these savings. So let's be real conservative. Let's only take credit for roughly a quarter of it. Great. Still a really large number. So there's things like that you can do to give your argument credibility. Because measuring those types of numbers with a real high degree of precision and accuracy is near impossible. So it's okay to estimate.